are going to see, let's say the basics of fundamental moral theology, the basics of moral theology, and you have the text with you. And what I am going to do is to make a very rather broad and elaborate introduction to the contents of that book. That's what we are going to do. So I extend you a very warm welcome to this session of, let's say, lasting for an hour. And then after the session, you'll have time to raise your questions if there are, and also time for an interaction, let's say, for a few minutes. Let me say, as you go through this text, you will come across a number of technical terms. Not all of them are may not be familiar with you. So some of them are really technical, but I must tell you that you don't have to study all the technical terms at this stage. In the book, you will find many of them. They are there for the sake of the completion of the text. So I will bypass some of those technical details and I shall focus on the necessary things, let's say the gist of each and every chapter. That's what I'm going to do. So you will get a brief introduction into the orientation and also the contents of each chapter, and thus we shall proceed. Let me start with a brief, let's say, introduction to the nature of theology or nature of moral theology. Learning moral theology is rather difficult, not very difficult, rather difficult. However, living a moral life is not that difficult. It is something like, let's say, learning an art. When you are learning an art, you will find it rather difficult. But when you become accustomed to that, when you start practicing that, it becomes very, very easy. Same is the case with regard to moral theology as well. So since we are in learning phase, you might have some difficult expressions, some concepts and so on. We not have them tools. So the most important thing is how we are able to learn moral theology and then live a moral life as per the norms of Christian tradition and also the Gospels. So this much as an introduction. And now, where is the scope of moral theology? So in Christian life, there are two elements, two important and broad elements. One is right faith. We call it as orthodoxy, right faith. The second aspect, equally important, is right practice, orthopraxis. Therein comes the scope of moral theology. So there is an element of right faith regarding the articles of faith, and there is also an aspect of right practice which comprises the elements of moral theology. Moral theology is also called Christian ethics, giving rather a greater emphasis to the philosophical content, that's in the ethical part. But we will be focusing on moral theology or Catholic moral theology, making use of the resources of Christian faith. We know what they are. They are definitely the scriptures, then the holy traditions, and then human reason, human experience, teachings of the church, and of course the particular sources, and sometimes also the insights from other sciences as well. So we will be focusing on moral theology as explained in Catholic tradition, but definitely depending on other sources available. That's a simple remark to start with. Another important thing, as you go through this text, as you go through this text, you will come across a number of references to laws, various kinds of laws, various classifications of laws, etc. Worry not too much about the laws. The most important thing is not the law, rather the values behind those laws. Each and every law communicates a value to be protected by the safeguards of a law. Be it civil law, be it canon law, be it any organizational law, or any kind of law, it means there is a value behind in order to be protected by the premises of that law. So law in itself is less important than the value to be protected by that law. So focus on the values. And as regards moral norms or moral rules or moral laws, we are focusing on the values behind them. So values are more important than the laws. And as regards the nature of moral theology, that has been divided into a general or fundamental moral theology and also a special moral theology. Such a division took place after the Trent Council in the 16th century. we shall not focus too much on that distinction. I just wanted to make a mention of such a distinction which has been in existence for some time. So the most important thing is not the technical details. They are for specialists. As far as we are concerned, I think the most important thing is to focus on the fundamentals of the science of Christian ethics. So much about the first chapter. Now we move on to the second one, which is basically on moral norms or moral rules. We know there are different kinds of rules. As I have already explained, we are more worried about or concerned about the values behind each and every rule. And in this chapter, we are focusing on some of the moral rules which are in use. Usually we speak about eternal laws. Eternal laws means laws given by God or designed by God, which are in existence, suggestive of certain, let's say, basic norms. One of the eternal norm is very simple and very fundamental. It is like this. For example, do good and avoid evil. Do good, avoid evil. Isn't it? You can't go beyond that or against that. Do good, avoid evil. But the practical or more complex question is, what is good and what is evil? In moral theology, what we do is to make distinctions between good and evil and right and wrong. So how to decide a particular good in a particular context, how to discern between right and wrong as regards to behavior. These are all questions that will emerge or that will be discussed in moral theology. So one area, the most fundamental level, is eternal rules. We shall not go into the details of eternal rules. Similarly, there are also the so-called natural law. Natural law is very, very important as regards the development of moral theology and also in dealing with moral questions. Natural law means a law written by God in the hearts of people who use human reason. So natural law is not merely a law, or rather that's a faculty aided by human reason so that we can make a distinction between good and evil or right and wrong. So in fact, natural law based on the nature of human being or human nature will help us to assess good and evil. To give an example, to get a taste of what natural law would mean, we argue or we hold or we say that stealing is wrong. But you can ask the question, why stealing is wrong? One can simply say it is forbidden by law. It is forbidden by the 10 Commandments. It is said in the Bible, things like that. These are all arguments which are all valid in themselves. But when you apply natural law, you will get a convincing reason by virtue of reason why stealing is wrong. How does that function? It goes like this. According to natural law, stealing is wrong. And the reasoning goes like this. Stealing is wrong. Otherwise, everybody can steal. If stealing is not right, is not wrong, you can steal, I can steal, anybody can steal from anywhere. In that case, your property also can be stolen by somebody else. Or we can argue that I can steal your property. But will you allow that? No, your nature will not allow that. Your human reason will not allow that. Because it is against your nature to concede your property rights to somebody without any claim or without any reason. Therefore, it is against your reason. And therefore, you conclude that stealing is against your nature. So, accordingly, as per natural law, stealing is wrong. You can apply the same logic to killing. Killing is wrong because it goes against reason. If it were as per the reason, you would allow to be killed by somebody else. But you don't do that because it is against your nature. You don't want to get killed, so you wouldn't allow that. You would simply flee from such a situation. And therefore, killing or getting killed is against your reason, against your nature. And therefore, you argue, or we can argue, that killing is wrong because it goes against natural law. So same kind of reasoning could be applied to very many cases or very many situations. That's one area. We don't go further into that theme. There is another kind of law which is simply called positive laws. Positive laws. Positive laws means laws created by or formulated by human beings. So positive laws means all laws created by, formulated by human beings over against natural law or over against eternal laws. So all laws formulated by the state, the church, an organization or a community or an institute, these are all positive laws. There are plenty of positive laws in the world. So they are all, so in the human-made laws, they are called, let's say, positive laws. So the reason why we make reference to laws is that they are all pointing to the protection of a value, pointing to the protection of a particular value. There are traffic rules by which the state or the government wants to protect the safety of the travelers, safety of pedestrians, and also other things. So these are all values to be protected by traffic rules, traffic laws. Same is the case with regard to moral rules, be it rules given by the state or by the 10 Commandments or the religious entities. All moral rules are meant to protect a particular value, be it human dignity, human life, honesty, truthfulness, and all other values. They are all protected by the kind of norms supportive of such rules. So while it is in that context, values becomes important. Values are important. Now we move on to the next chapter, that's on conscience. Conscience. Conscience is very, very important as regards moral development and also moral life. We are all familiar with the expression or the word conscience or conscience formation. Conscience is important because conscience refers to the subjective core of morality, the subjective core or the subjective pole, P-O-L-E, pole of morality. There is an objective realm, there is an objective level of morality enshrined in the norms, rules, values, etc. When you try to personalize that, when you try to get it into your personal life with a conviction, with the knowledge, it then becomes part of your conscience. It somehow becomes part of your conscience. That part is called the subjective moral core. The subjective moral core. That's very, very important. It is important because God judges a person as per his or her conscience. God judges a person considering the question whether he or she has lived up to the demands of his or her conscience, not up to the objective norms or not up to the objective standards, but his conscience is important or her conscience is important. Whether one has been following one's own conscience, that's the most important thing. So God's judgment would take into account the way in which one has followed one's own conscience. So conscience issues and judgment by the person on right and wrong and good and bad. So conscience is informed by human reason. Conscience is informed by the values taught by the Bible, values held in the rules and norms, values transmitted by the elders, values propounded by the society, etc. So there is an ongoing process of conscience formation taking place everywhere and also in the life of all people. In the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Old Testament, you may not find the word conscience as such. Instead, we find the word heart being used in the sense of conscience, heart. So heart refers to the inner core of the person, signifying the moral indication moral judgment, moral promptings of the person. So there are plenty of occasions in the text in the Old Testament where conscience is indicated by the word heart. Whereas in the New Testament, we don't find the use of conscience in the Gospels, but it is found in the writings of St. Paul. He uses the Greek word synedesis to communicate the meaning of what we call conscience. So conscience is very, very important. It is closer to consciousness. In fact, it refers to one's own moral consciousness. And conscience is important because, first of all, it issues a judgment on a situation. Secondly, it gives inspiration for the person to follow that. And thirdly, it gives a force to execute that. And finally, that give you a sort of prick of conscience or a guilt feeling or a negative judgment if you have failed. In other words, in a religious sense, we can speak about repentance, the sense of contrition. All these are contributed by the functioning of conscience. So conscience is very, very important. So one of the tasks of teachers, parents, and priests, etc., is to enlighten the conscience of people, to sensitize the conscience of children, to develop and form the conscience of people. One of the important tasks of the church is to do that. Conscientize people as regards moral demands, moral truths, without violating their conscience. That's very important. So the church is not at all entitled to violate the conscience of another person. Nobody can violate the conscience of other people. What the church can do is to enlighten people, throw light on moral issues, teach them about truth. They have to accept them. Individuals have to accept those truths individually, personally, accept them and make them part of one's own conscience. So that the church cannot violate the conscience of other person. That's very important. And therefore, Vatican II teaches that the conscience is inviolable. Conscience cannot be violated at any point by anybody. Nobody can violate the conscience of other people. Nobody can rule over the conscience of other people. That's why St. Thomas Aquinas made a very, very, let's say, so to say, a drastic statement that there are occasions, or there could be occasions on which your conscience might conflict with the teachings of the church or the proposals of the church sometimes. Your own conscience, well-informed conscience, may stand against a verdict of the church sometimes, maybe very rarely. If your conscience is well-formed, if you are thoroughly sure that you are true in your conviction in conscience, Thomas would say you don't have to abide by the teaching of that church. In case if you are going to be excommunicated from the church because of that position, Thomas Aquinas would say, just bear that, accept to get excommunicated rather than violating your own conscience. So supremacy of protecting one's own conscience, that's given by Thomas Aquinas. But it's very important that you can't simply say that I am following my conscience in a very loose way. Your conscience must be mature, it must be autonomous, it must be well-formed, and you must be morally certain, morally sure about the positions taken by yourself after considering all the teachings of the church, all the relevant teachings of the church, reasoning behind them, and also the seriousness of the matter, etc. So one cannot very, in a loose manner, say that I follow my conscience and do or take one's own opinion as a judgment of the conscience. A judgment of the conscience must be a considered opinion by oneself after consulting all the relevant teachings and sources, including the Bible. We can also make distinctions regarding the nature of conscience. For example, there can be a tender conscience, a conscience which is sensitive, a conscience which is very lax in its approach, a conscience which is rather perplexed, a conscience which is unnecessarily doubtful about the nature of a particular reality, nature of oneself, etc. Scrupulosity, doubtful character, deep down in one's heart and mind. These are all possible. When we talk about the most positive kind of conscience, that's an autonomous conscience and morally certain about its judgment. An autonomous conscience means a conscience which is not dependent on others outside oneself. It is not dependent on the opinions of other people, such as elders and others. It is self-run. It is autonomous because it is well formed. It is sure about its own judgments. So such conscience is a binding conscience. Such conscience is a binding conscience. So, as I have already said, conscience is inviolable. We are supposed to follow them or obey the conscience. For example, you will find a reference to conscience in Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1800, CCC 1800. So conscience is to be followed always. And therefore, we can also say conscience is to be formed. By birth, we do not get a well-formed conscience. As you grow in age, as you grow in wisdom, you will somehow begin to form your conscience. And there must be a conscious effort to form one's own conscience. Otherwise, our conscience could be ill-formed rather than well-formed. Particularly in the development of children, there must be focus on formation of conscience, giving them the right sources of moral truth, such as moral truths taken or drawn from the Bible, scriptural sources, and teachings of the church, then sound reason, then let's say human experience, etc. And of course, there are also well-meaning traditions, not all traditions, but well-meaning traditions which are also in correspondence with scriptural teachings. So conscience needs to be formed. And if we do not take conscious effort to form the conscience of children, other people, including media or social media, would form the conscience of children in their own ways. So parents are entitled or obliged to form the conscience of children. Similarly, we can say one more issue, namely sometimes there can be conflict between conscience, your own conscience, and also with the norms and the requirements from the part of other people. You might run into a conflict of conscience. In such cases, what you're supposed to do is to check with all the resources, check with your own reasoning. Then finally, make sure that you are certain about your own judgment of the conscience. And finally, follow your conscience. Follow your conscience. That's how we proceed. So, so much about the formation of conscience and conscience as such. Now we move on to the fourth chapter, which is on human act. Human act. The expression human act means an act or an action done by a human being with knowledge and consent. Any action done by a person with knowledge and consent. What is remarkable is that there are actions done without knowledge and consent. Sometimes we tend to act without knowledge of what we are doing and also without giving proper or full consent. So the object of moral evaluation is only human acts. In other words, only human acts can be subjected to moral evaluation. Others escape the realm of moral evaluation. So the first thing is, let's say, knowledge. knowledge. It's an action done with the knowledge. Knowledge means what the knowledge regarding the nature of action, what you are doing, and also the implications or the consequences of that act. Both must be there in order to qualify it as a human act. Knowledge. Actions done by animals do not come under this under human act not because they are actions done by animal acts, but because they lack knowledge. Animals simply do not know what they are doing. They are acting out of instinct. They do not know what they are doing. They are not sure of the consequences of what they are doing. They are acting in an instinctive way, responding to a kind of stimulus. And therefore, we shall not judge that this particular action of this particular animal is morally right or wrong. A dog might bite a person dangerously. Still, we don't call that act as immoral. A dog biting a person is not called an immoral act because there's an act done by an animal without knowledge and consent. Whereas in the case of a human being biting another person, it simply would become an immoral act because it is supposed to be a human act. So first thing, knowledge. We might sometimes lack knowledge regarding the consequences of an act or even the nature of an act. If there is a deficiency or defect in the knowledge of an act, you become less responsible for that act morally. So what matters is first knowledge. Suppose that you are not at all aware of the nature of the act, you will not be responsible. You can't be held responsible for that act morally. For example, think about the act of sterilization. Sterilization. Let's say about 30 or 40 years ago, people used to have or undergo sterilization. But usually people were not aware of the nature of that act. They simply thought they are stopping further deliveries or stopping the possibility of having more children or further children. In a way, they took that act in a morally neutral way. Suppose that a woman had a sterilization undergone 30 years ago, and recently she participated in a retreat, and she came to know that 30 years ago she did sterilization and that it was immoral. Is she responsible for that? Morally, no, because she did it without any knowledge regarding the nature of that act. She was not at all aware of the nature of that act. She was not informed about the moral nature of that act. So, lack of knowledge or defective knowledge will tell upon the range of responsibility of a person regarding that act. That's one thing. Second area, in certain cases, more than that, the consequences could be vital or fatal. Act is rather simple or let's say minor nature, but the consequences could be of greater nature. The consequences could be damaging. The consequences could be demanding or too much demanding. In certain cases, people may not really know the consequences of an action which a person engages in. Usually, we are supposed to be aware of what we do and also the consequences. Usually, as we grow in age, as we get proper training, we are supposed to become aware of the complex consequences of what we are doing in specialized fields. For example, a medical doctor, what she is doing or what he is doing. After medical training, she must know the implications of the same. But a layperson may not know about that. Whereas in the case of certain important things, for example, you shall not kill. Nobody should go to a college in order to understand that killing is wrong. The knowledge regarding such fundamental acts must be gained by oneself. Nobody should be informed by an external authority or external source that stealing
Congratulations.
is wrong. Stealing is wrong. Okay, so we must be aware of the range of. We must be aware of the consequences of the act also. That's about the first element. So knowledge and consent. Second part is about consent. Consent. Willful assent. So if an act is done without consent, without the part of consent, it is no more a human act. So we are supposed to give consent or a willful assent to what we do. Sometimes people could be challenged in offering their consent by various reasons, by various elements. For example, force. You might be forced to do something. You might be forced to act in a particular way. Without your consent, you are made to act in a particular way. But in fact, whoever is, let's say, taking the decision by giving consent, they are responsible for that act, not the person who does that material act. For example, think about an abortion. In an abortion case, usually we think that the woman who has undergone an abortion is responsible for that act. Not necessarily so. Who is responsible? The person who has really taken the decision to have done. So in certain cases, it could be the decision could be taken by the husband. Sometimes it could be done by the whole family together. In certain other case, it would have been done by the woman herself. So whoever has taken the decision is really responsible for the act. And they are to be held responsible. And in fact, they are to make the confession also. Not necessarily the woman herself. In certain cases, the woman may have had little role in taking the decision because she gave no consent to that. Abortion took place against her consent, and therefore she has only little responsibility for the same. According to the range of the consent which she gave, her responsibility varies, and therefore sometimes consent could be challenged by various factors. For example, force, then false impressions, even habitual acts. A person doing habitual acts for some time could be under the force of that habit. And she or he acts in such a way that she cannot do otherwise. She is under the strong force of the habit. And in such cases, the responsibility varies, the responsibility diminishes. And therefore, we need to assess the moral responsibility of people as per the consent part also. Sometimes psychological factors might affect people's consent. Psychological factors. People with, let's say, low IQ, with the defective mental structures, mental operations, etc. Their acts need not be fully human, totally human, because that they might be impaired in the knowledge part and also in the consent part. So responsibility is to be assessed in terms of the amount of knowledge and the consent which a person exercised in taking a decision to do something or not to do something. So this is how we need to evaluate a human act. So that's very important in that area. In certain cases, we are supposed to know the reality. Supposed to know. In certain other cases, we are excused from ignorance. You didn't know that because you couldn't gain knowledge about that. But whereas in certain other cases, you are supposed to know. So, for example, uh, a married woman or a married man is supposed to know the responsibilities of marriage, responsibilities of life of husband and wife. They are supposed to know because they are married, and they are married in a marriageable age. They are supposed to know that. A person driving a vehicle is supposed to know the traffic rules. You can't plead ignorance while driving a vehicle, because you are a driver. You must have had license, and therefore you are supposed to know the traffic rules. You can't plead ignorance. Similar is the case with regard to other situations also. Whereas in certain other cases, you may have ignorance, and that ignorance could be excused. Sometimes strong emotions coming on the way of your taking decisions might influence you. The disruption of emotions, strong emotions, impulsive behavior. These are all situations where your responsibility will be diminished in a serious way. So much about knowledge and consent. In order to assess, that's also the next part also is very, very important. In order to assess the morality of an act, you need to consider three things. One, the act done, the act performed. Secondly, the intention behind the act. And thirdly, the circumstances. So take these three things into account, take them together and assess the morality of the act. So what is done, what is performed, that's the act. The intention behind doing that, the motive behind that, why somebody did that, that's very important, intention. And thirdly, the circumstance in which it is done. What is the context in which it was done, whether positive or negative. So behind every act, whether positive or negative, moral or immoral, you will come across these three elements: an act, intention, and a circumstance. And we need to assess them together, not in isolation. So these three things are to be considered in order that we can assess whether something is good or bad. Sometimes the act would be good and the intention could be bad. Act is done well, but the intention is bad. Conversely, also it can happen that you are doing something wrong, immoral, act is immoral, but your intention is good. Intention is good. For example, you are stealing, act is stealing, but you have a good intention of helping somebody else, a third party. So good act, bad intention. Then circumstance also will play their role. So in order to assess an act to be good, these three things are to be taken into account. That's how we make a moral evaluation of the act. Otherwise, we will run into wrong conclusions. We now go to the next chapter. That's on a particular context. That's called the principle of totality and also the principle of double effect. Worry not too much about those two names. What is important is the context in which these principles or norms are propounded. The context. The context is rather simple, namely, you are doing something good, but the act produces bad effects. While doing something good, in the very act of doing a particular thing, you are also producing bad effects, wrong or unexpected effects. And the question is, can you perform such actions? If you are doing something and simultaneously, if that is producing bad effects also, are you entitled to do such effects? Answers, as per two contexts, are given by two principles. One is the principle of totality, and the other is the principle of double effect. Principle of totality means it's very simple, namely, we are supposed to respect the totality of the person, totality of the human body, totality of an organism. That's a very simple thing. Usually, we are supposed to respect physical integrity, physical totality of the person. That is called the principle of totality. However, in certain cases, we may have to sacrifice the physical totality and then save the person. You are sacrificing, you are forfeiting the physical integrity, physical totality of the person and saving the person. In that case, you are allowed to do that. If necessary, you can sacrifice the physical integrity of the person so that you can save that person. What you do in a mutilation is the same. Mutilation, you are mutilating the body. You are cutting away one organ from the body so that you can save the body. Particularly when you are treating diseases, sickness, in surgeries, you are doing that. But the important thing is that you shall not sacrifice or you shall not forsake functional integrity of the person. Functional integrity. For example, in organ donation, in living organ donation, we will lose physical integrity of the body, but we will not lose functional integrity of the body. You will be functioning as a human being, even though you are donating a kidney to somebody else or part of your liver to someone else. You can function without much difficulty. Your functional integrity will be maintained even though your physical integrity is sacrificed. So this principle is used in such cases, in such situations. That's the first thing. And the secondly, about the principle of double effect. It's a little bit more complicated. Principle of double effect. The word is indicative of the situation in which this principle is applied. You are doing something and thereby double effects are produced. Double effects. One effect is a good effect, the other one is a bad effect. A single act produces double effects, good and bad effects simultaneously. Are you entitled to do such acts? That's a question. Answer is simple, namely, you can do such acts provided you respect or you fulfill 4 conditions. If your actions or if your choice is able to fulfill 4 conditions, you can perform such acts. What are those 4 conditions? 1, the act must be good in itself. The act that you do must be good in itself or at least morally neutral. That's the first thing. Secondly, the good effect and bad effects must follow simultaneously. Good effects and bad effects must come out simultaneously at the same time, not one after the other. Simultaneous results. Thirdly, your goal or intention must be good. You must have a good intention. And finally, there must be a proportion between the good and the evil foreseen in that act. There must be proportion, morally convincing proportion between the good effect wanted and the bad effect foreseen. If you are able to fulfill these 4 conditions, you can perform such an act. To give an example, think about ectopic pregnancy, the case of an ectopic pregnancy or tubal pregnancy. A woman gets pregnant, but the fetus is growing in the fallopian tube. And it is going to be doomed because the child or the fetus will not grow into the term. It will not complete the growth in the tubal stage. So what is required is a surgery. And it's part of treatment. So you're doing a surgery. That is good. Intention is good because you want to treat the mother, not to have an abortion, rather to treat the mother. And in the process of treatment, and though you don't want it, you don't desire that, that the pregnancy could be destroyed or the fetus would be destroyed. Pregnancy. But there is a proportion between the good and evil because one life is saved, and the other life is lost. So there is a proportion between the two. And therefore, in such a case, such a treatment could be taken. Not that such an abortion could be allowed. Abortion is never allowed in Catholic tradition. But this is something called indirect abortion, where we do not directly intend to have such an abortion performed. We don't want it, we don't desire it, we don't mean to have such an abortion, but what we mean is only a treatment. Whereas in another situation, for example, if you are treating a mother, a pregnant woman, for a cardiac problem, and the doctor says if the pregnancy grows to term, a mother's life will be challenged. You can't do that. You can't resort to an abortion and save the mother, because you are doing something else. You are not acting the act. So the good effect and bad effects are not coming from the same act. You are performing an abortion so that you try to save the mother. That is not allowed. So there's a difference between direct abortion and indirect abortion. Now we move to the next chapter, that's on cooperation. Cooperation, particularly on material cooperation. Cooperation in evil. We know we as human beings living in a society, very often we are bound to cooperate with other people, either in good acts or in bad acts, moral or immoral acts. We'll be forced to cooperate with people. There is what we call a material cooperation, in contrast to formal cooperation. Formal means willful and knowledgeable cooperation. Knowing what you are doing and knowing what other person is doing, you are cooperating with a person in committing a wrong act. That's formal cooperation. Whereas in material cooperation, you are cooperating with other person, but without your proper consent. You don't give consent to cooperate with him or with her, but somehow out of force, out of the compulsory situation, you are made to cooperate with that person. That is what is meant by material cooperation instead of formal cooperation. So therefore, if your cooperation is only material, or to the extent it is material or material only, your responsibility is diminished. Your responsibility is diminished. And therefore, we must be careful about the kind of cooperation that we do. So in principle, we are not supposed to cooperate with evil in any way, with individuals, with the systems, let's say with any kind of organization that perpetuate evil. We are not supposed to cooperate with them. But sometimes, knowingly or unknowingly, we may have to be in a situation to cooperate with others directly or indirectly, with intention or without intention. If you are doing that with intention, intentionally, it is formal, for which you are responsible. Whereas if you are doing out of force, without your consent, it is only a material consent for which you are not responsible, or responsibility will be seriously diminished. That's about cooperation. Now we go to the next chapter, that's on sin. Sin is not merely an ethical discussion or a moral theological discussion as such. It is rather a spiritual theme. We know sin is basically, it is standing against God, rebelling against God, moving against God, or getting away from God. That's all. These are all religious expressions in which we understand sin. And because of our original sin, we have a propensity to commit, let's say, other sins. So sin is an act against the love of God. Because we are created by God, we are created for God, and when we get away from God, whenever we move away from the covenantal relationship with God, we are in a sinful state. So to say that sin is the breaking of the commandment is only a minimal or a reductionistic understanding of sin. That's only a legal kind of an expression of sin. Sin is much more than that. It is breaking of the covenantal relationship with God. breaking of the covenantal relationship with God. Why do we make reference to covenant? Because commandments were given in the context of the covenant in the Old Testament. Because the covenant meant a stable, enduring relationship between God and his people, established by Moses and Yahweh through the exchange of the commandments and the willingness to follow them, the Moses and rights. So covenant is a stable relationship, an ongoing relationship between two parties. It's not merely just an agreement, much more than that. So it was in the context of the covenant, the idea of sin, the notion of sin came to evolve in the mind of Israelites. And therefore, even in Christian tradition, we understand sin in the same way. Namely, it is a breaking of relationship with God, with other people, with oneself, and with nature. And therefore, sin is a spiritual reality, basically a spiritual reality where the relationship matters most. Relationship with God, with others, with nature and oneself. From a moral point of view, we make a distinction between grave sin or mortal sin and venial sin. That's a distinction between the two. If a grave object or grave matter is violated in a willful way with the knowledge and consent, we call it as a mortal sin. Whereas a light matter is violated or destroyed with the knowledge or consent, it is called a venial sin. That's a rather technical and I must say also legal kind of an explanation. What matters is whether one is in a smooth and positive relationship with God. That's the most important. Yeah. Okay, please.
Father, are we still 49th slide? Because the moral and venials here are not visible on 49th. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Or maybe it is internet problem. I'm sorry if I am wrong.
Okay.
Yes, Father. Now we can
that
see.
will, that will appear.
Now it's visible. Fine. Thank you very much, Father.
Okay. All right. Okay, fine. See, there are a little more things to be said about sin. We don't do them. We just move to the next one. That's about the next chapter. That's on different moral approaches. That's a technical area where we find different theories or approaches to morality. The basic question which you need to know is simple, namely, how do we make the judgment that something is good or wrong? How do we make the judgment as a particular idea or particular principle or a particular act is good or bad? There are different approaches. You will find them in different religions, different moral traditions, and within Catholicism, and also in philosophy. These are all enumerated in this chapter. How we make a judgment on a particular action or a particular approach to call it or to qualify it as good or bad. For example, in Catholic tradition, we speak about let's say theological ethics as per the end, as per the goal served by a particular act, you call it as bad or good. So these are all technical distinctions which you may not have to know them in detail, because that's basically meant for specialists, all the technical details. So there are plenty of reference to such different approaches in this chapter. We leave them and we move to the last one. That's on let's say Oriental approach to morality. Oriental approach to morality. We know the church, for historical reasons, has been divided into Occidental and Oriental churches, the Latin Church and also the West Eastern churches. And the Eastern churches focus also has developed their own moral theology in a way different from the Western churches. Western churches have focused more on, let's say, the exercise of reasoning, logical reasoning, whereas the Eastern churches have sought to depend more on scriptural references, let's say, poetic expressions, then teachings of the fathers, etc. So both of them are valid in their own ways. Both of them are complementary, so to say, or to be very honest. Both of them represent two ways of looking at moral, let's say, moral questions. But in conclusion, we can say moral values are the same both in Eastern churches and also in the Western churches. Moral values are the same. Killing is wrong in Oriental churches as well as in Latin church. No difference. But the way you come to that conclusion, that's different. That's the difference. So the conclusions would be the same, almost the same, probably in certain cases with some minor exceptions. But with regard to all fundamental values, conclusions are the same, but the way in which you reach up to that conclusion would be different in Oriental churches or in Latin church. That's the only difference that you have to keep in mind. Similarly, the way in which the scriptures are used, the fathers are used, or the traditions are used, they are all different. There is a predominant recourse to human reason in the Western church, but in Eastern churches, it's mostly other sources which are given more importance in order to come to the moral conclusions, which are also taken by the Western church. Similarly, there is also a reference to an additional reference to liturgy, baptism, etc., in order that people be motivated, people be encouraged to follow a moral life. That's a positive thing. Let me say in a different way. Let's say another highlight of the Oriental churches. Moral theology is supposed not only to highlight good and bad or make a distinction between right and wrong, rather to encourage people, motivate people to do good. That also is meant by moral theology, both in the East and in the West. Theology makes use of various tools in order to encourage people to follow a moral or morally sound life. That also is there. So with this, it's our time. With this, I stop describing the nature of moral theology as such. And now it's open.